The following program discusses sensitive issues related to sexuality. Parents are cautioned this presentation may be too candid for younger audiences.
Welcome to Intimate Clarity. I'm Jason Bradley, and here with me is Jennifer Jill Schwarzer. She is a licensed professional counselor, and today we're going to be discussing a sensitive topic, but it's a conversation we need to have. Jen, what is so bad about sex before marriage?
Glad you asked it. Really glad you asked it. Our first sexual encounter formats us in terms of our appetites and our attractions. So if our first encounter is in a transient relationship, which typically sex before marriage tends to be casual, uncommitted, transient relationships that are based on emotion and kind of the thrill of the moment. If that's our first encounter, we're going to have an attraction to that, an appetite for that. Maybe latent, maybe overwritten by better things, but it'll remain with us throughout our lives. So then you end up in a marriage and you're in a committed relationship. Well, if your sexual attraction is activated by a transient relationship, you're not going to feel as sexually attracted to a committed relationship. And then you meet someone at work and you think about having a fling, and that's going to light a fire under you. So we're doing that to ourselves. We're molding ourselves in those initial encounters.
Sounds like a bunch of confusion. We're confusing ourselves.
And it's a scary thought, isn't it? But let's just reverse that and say that God designed us such that our first sexual encounter take place within a committed relationship. And it works in the positive, because once you have that sexual encounter in a committed relationship, that's what lights you up, so to speak, sexually and turns you on.
And not just in a committed relationship, but within the confines of marriage.
Marriage, that's right. That's right. Absolutely. Well, I'm thinking as a scientist. It's hard to measure if people are married or not, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And we want to put God's ideal out there. We believe in God's creatorship. We always put out God's design, but then we like to show that there is a path back to that design through his redemptive power. He's a creator and a redeemer, but God's design is monogamous, committed marriage for life. That's his ideal. We want to leave the ideal in place. So there are some statistics, and it's amazing as you dig down into the science, it often proves God's plan, sometimes in the negative, but it proves it nonetheless. It shows consequences when we stray from God's plan. Here's an example. One study showed the divorce risk of women with no partners before marriage hovered around 6%. One partner before marriage raised it to 20%. And two partners raised it to 30%. So the more partners before marriage, the greater the divorce risk of the woman. And unfortunately, I don't have stats for men, although I'm sure it's similar. Does that bother you at all? Or?
Those are huge numbers. That climb is,
But I want to bring out, too, that promiscuity is not just a female problem.
No,
the same standard applies to males and females. You know, God requires the same thing of both.
In fact, you see a lot of pressure on men not to be virgins. There's a lot of pressure from the world for men not to be virgins.
And in fact, in the media, you're a laughingstock if you're a virgin past your teens. There's a film called 40-Year-Old Virgin, and that's supposed to be kind of a dig on that person, but I just think 40-year-old virgin, that's awesome, you know? That shows a lot of self-restraint. There's a cool quotation from the book Patriarchs and Prophets in the chapter about Samson, because he had a little bit of self-control problems, you know, when it came to sexuality, if you recall. And it says, a man's strength is determined not by the strength of his passions, but by the strength of the passions that he controls. And that's why it's cool to be a 40-year-old virgin. It shows strength. It shows restraint.
And guys should want to be virgins until they get married. You know, how cool would it be to have only been with one woman, you know, you and your wife, and her only with one man, you know?
That's right.
You.
We see that in the story of Isaac and Rebekah. This is really cool. It's the most detailed account of the courtship process of any patriarch in the entire Bible. is the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. You remember the story. Abraham sends his servant to find a partner for his wife. And there's this whole story where the servant goes to town square and he prays and he's at the well and he says, send me a woman who, when I ask her to give me water, I think it was she offers to water my camels as well. He opens his eyes from the prayer and there's a beautiful woman standing there and she does exactly that. And that turns out to be Rebekah. And they are brought together in marriage. Isaac was 40 years old at the time that he was married. And the self-restraint that he exercised on himself to remain a virgin through his sexual prime. I'm assuming he was a virgin because he was a follower of God, and that was a big deal in those days. So I don't think, kids messed around when they were part of that kind of family,
Yeah.
And so I'm assuming he was a virgin, 40 years old, the same self-restraint that he exercised when he was single, he exercised in his marriage. It's the only patriarchal marriage in which there was no polygamy.
Wow.
And it's like God is saying, look, this is how you do it.
Wow.
This is how you stay faithful to your spouse. In the U.S., the number of women who are virgins at marriage went from 21% in the 70s to 5% today. Don't mean to be picking on women, but it's typically, historically been that there's been a lot of cads out there, the boys, a lot of bad boys, a lot of boys willing to have sex, but just a few girls that were willing. But it's kind of changed now, and the willingness is on both sides.
Which seems, when you really think about it, that seems like statistics are skewed in the sense that these people have to be having sex with somebody. So, why aren't they included in that statistic? They're willing participants.
Well,
and where's that number?
More importantly, why aren't we putting the same moral responsibility on men that we put on women? I had a friend that went to church in a major city, and the girls, would get pregnant. And they were told, you can't come to church because they'd be seen in front of the church and everybody knew they were single, and that would create an outcry and a scandal. The boys would come to church. The church would do nothing to prevent the boys, so the girls would be punished for what they both did together.
That's messed up too.
That isn't fair.
Yeah, that's a double standard. And they need to be in church.
Yeah.
Like, they need to be hearing the word.
Oh, definitely.
They need to be getting to know Christ
on multiple
better.
levels.
Yeah,
that was all
absolutely.
Around, yeah. But, I think the attitude is that, guys' sex drives are so strong, we can't really expect them to control them. And we kind of do that with, for instance, these type A personalities that have these strong, just general drives, and they end up the president.
Yeah, that's really lowering the standard.
And then they say, well, he's just the kind of guy that, he's just one of those powerful men. He can have any woman he wants, and you can't expect him to be faithful. And I think you're just really selling out when you do that. Yeah. So the million-dollar question is, can people recover from sexual impurity? And I just want to say a resounding yes, they can. And in fact, there's an individual at the center of the story of the gospel whom Jesus said of her, wherever this gospel is preached, tell what she's done, because she anointed him with precious ointment and washed his feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. And Jesus said he wanted her story, what she did, and in memory of her, he said, so it wasn't just about what she did, it was about her as a person. Wanted that told all over the world. Yeah. There will be a time when every person in the world has heard the story of Jesus. And every person in the world will also have heard the story of Mary Magdalene.
Yes.
Jesus wanted the spotlight on her. And I think one of the most important elements of her story is that she recovered from sexual abuse, apparently. And then her own sinful response to that abuse was to pursue a life of prostitution. Deep, dark sexual immorality. And Jesus was able to not only salvage her out of that, but to use her as she's the premier disciple. I mean, which disciple did he say, tell what they've done? Peter, he said, flesh and blood, that's like the only compliment he gave a disciple, like flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. But moments later, he's saying, get behind me, Satan, So Peter was kind of short-lived, but he said of Mary, this incredible commendation on her as a person and her journey and how she'd come through and was now really demonstrating the character of God in her offering of ointment and showing what the cross looked like as she poured herself out for Jesus. And he said, tell what she's done. She became the premier disciple. He put her on display before the world. Wow. So God is not, he doesn't just kind of hide the people that have made mistakes. Okay, I can fix this, but don't ever tell anyone. He makes a big deal out of it. He did it in the case of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, I mean, and when you look at a lot of people in the Bible, you see they've all fallen short Moses, David, King Solomon. I mean, all these people have
fallen short of the glory of
Samson,
God.
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to the question of, do we believe in radical transformation? We believe that God has an ideal, and often Christian circles will really idealize God's plan for marriage. You know, stay clean, stay pure until marriage. You know, preserve yourself. When we prize and value virginity for males
and females.
Or for females and males, I should say. And so that's really important, and we need to keep that ideal in place. But we also, as Christians, believe in radical change. And when a person strays from that ideal, there is a route back. And they don't have to feel like they're damaged goods, and they'll never be able to function as healthy, godly human beings. I deal with married couples, young people in premarital counseling, and oftentimes one has made more mistakes than the other. What do they do with that? Well, I say, you know what? What really matters is not the mistakes they've made, it's the depth of their repentance. And actually, speaking to the pure one, if your repentance, because we all need repentance.
Absolutely.
If your repentance is less deep than their repentance, they're actually more likely to be a faithful partner than you, even though they have a worse track record. That's the power of repentance and what God can do.
How's that Bible verse go? To him who is forgiven much
shall much be granted. Yeah.
Yes.
And it says the goodness of God leads us to repentance, and that the sorrow that is according to the will of God leads to repentance, not to be repented of, but the sorrow of the world leads to death. So the core of true biblical repentance is that we see really what our sin did to other people and to God. Because you think about Peter, you know, Peter thought about what his sin had done to Jesus, but Judas thought about what his sin had done to himself. And his remorse, his sorrow for sin, which was very real, was totally self-centered, and it led to death. But Peter's repentance led to salvation from the very sin that had brought the repentance to begin with.
Wow.
And that's possible for people who have strayed from God's ideal. God can break the spell of that sin on your heart, and you can be radically transformed and become a steadfast follower of Jesus. Peter went on to, he had started out the great denier, and he became the great proclaimer.
Amen.
And he himself was martyred for preaching the gospel. But he said, I don't even want to be crucified the way Jesus was crucified. Hang me upside down. Yeah, that's right. But he himself was martyred for proclaiming the gospel rather than denying the gospel. He started out at A, he ended up at Z. You know, he went through a radical transformation, and that's possible for individuals who found themselves in deep sexual sin. It's possible to experience transformation, and we encourage them to pursue that course, don't we?
And God's longing for them to come to him. Anything that they're going through, take it to the Lord.
That's
you know, he wants to hear from you. He already knows anyway, you know, but he wants you to bring that to him and ask him for forgiveness.
You know, purity culture was real big in Christian circles, especially a couple decades back up to, you know, recent times. And I think it's still active in certain circles. But one of the issues with purity culture is there was so much focus on the ideal that there wasn't sufficient emphasis on how do you get back from that idea, from straying from that ideal. And so I think when we approach this issue, we need to do it with both of those things in mind constantly.
Yes. You know, I love the fact, like we discuss gaining the victory. You know, because I think that's so important. You know, Satan wants you to believe, oh no, God doesn't love you, you've gone too far or whatever. But God he's longing for his children. You know,
to get the
he
victory.
Wants that relationship with you, and he's faithful to give us that victory.
That's right. Him
Jen,
is able to keep you from falling and
we're
present
out
you
of time.
faultless
before
the presence of his glory.
Absolutely. Make sure you check out intimateclarity.tv for resources, and we look forward to seeing you next time.